What's up, nerds? Today is a good one. I mean, they're all good, but today's gonna be a good one. I got a new microphone. Hope that sounds better. Less keystrokes, less scraping against the mic, and we're gonna do some front-end integration, building off of what we did last time. So for you, those of you who may have forgotten or don't remember, last time we integrated our backend and our PostgreSQL database so that we could create users with a curl request. And if we look and see in our database and we select all the enabled users, we have 2. The app is already running. I do this curl, I create a new user. Now you can see we have 3 users. So that's cool. Shows a little bit of integration, shows how an API works, but you would never do this in real life, right? You actually need the front end, you need it to actually do something through the UI so that it's user friendly, it looks better. So we are in part C. There was A, there was B, and now we're at C of our DB integration. And what we've built is our code review objectives are 1, create 2 new APIs, 1 to delete users, which really means just mark the user with enabled as false. It's a soft delete. And then another API that says getEnabledUsers, which returns the full list of users where enabled is true. Next, we'll create 3 new front-end components, a createUsers button, and that button will do what the curl request did. It'll create a new user. A delete user by username form will have an input, text input for the username, a button to submit the form. It will call delete user and mark that username if it exists with enabled as false. And then a view enabled users table. So we will get all the enabled users and we will load them and populate a table for however many users we get back. And then we're going to take all 3 of those components and we're going to put them in one single Angular front-end dashboard, which will just be a composite of all 3 components. Now, I'll prove to you that we're going to do this because I've already done it. So like I said, the app is running and this is the view all enabled users. And like I said, it already shows you the same thing that we saw before. So now you can create a new user with this button. It says create a new user, and we're using the interval timer, so it's already loaded here. You can go here and say boom, 4 new rows. Let's add another new user. We've added one. It appears here automatically, didn't refresh the screen, and sure enough, it's in the database. So if we want to delete these, we can take a username, put it in here, click delete user. It says it's been disabled, it disappears, and when we look at the number of enabled users, we're down to 4. We can do it again. Now this user's been disabled, it automatically leaves, check the database, and sure enough it's gone. So that's the demo, that's what the code's going to do. So let's do a code review and see how all this went down. So the first objective was to create 2 new APIs. So the first step, we already knew what APIs we wanted. The first step we have to follow through is to update our user repository. So we're going to go to the Java code and we will go to the user repository. And the first query that we're going to add is find by enabled is true. That's going to return an optional list of user objects. Optional because it could return none, and so we want to be able to handle that in a Lambda format, and then it's just a list of users. So it could be an empty list or a list of users. And like we said, a user is this entity. It's a record in the users table, and this user repository is building queries to return those. So one thing I want to call out is, you might ask, well, is this really all you have to do? And the answer is yes. I have a better example here, but all 3 of these queries are equivalent. So the JPA repository is smart enough to know that when you do find by enabled is true, and it knows it's using this user entity, it says, okay, you're talking about this Boolean enabled, and you want all the times where it's true. So just by the way you name this, it's able to build a query for you. And that's not always clear, but that's what's happening. So when I have find by username, again, user has a property, username, which is a string. So it just knows what this means. It's saying, okay, you're giving it a string. We're going to try and match this to the username. And we're going to find one user or 0 users, an optional. So it's either there or not, present or not. And we'll return that user. But this find by username is exactly the same as if you had added a query. And you could say, select user from user. So again, this capital user maps to this entity. It's kind of a pseudo SQL. And then I name it user, where user.username is equal to username. So this colon username matches this property name, and user.username is just a dot notation used because we're using a pseudocode where we're mapping to these entity Java objects rather than using raw SQL. So find by username, string username, is the exact same as this query value in JPA, which is exactly the same as using a native query, which is true, which is just select star from users where username equals colon username. So all three of these are equivalent. It's obviously easiest and most succinct to just use the find by for such simple queries, so that's what we'll do. But I did want to call out, and maybe I'll create a separate video, but these are all the exact same query in JPA. But so to do this, to make these APIs, I needed to find by enabled as true, get the list of users, and then find by username. So once I've added these user repository find bys, these queries, I need to go back to the user controller where we keep our APIs, and I need to add delete user, which I did. So we have delete user here. And what delete user does is it's a put request because we're updating the field. We're not actually deleting it. It's a soft delete. But it follows delete, and then you pass in the username, and we map this dynamic variable value to the path variable string username. It's a put request, like I said. It will produce an application.json, JSON. But basically, yeah, you have a user, and it's called existing user. And this is where you get the user repository, and you say find by username, and you pass in the username from the URL. If you can't find a user, if the optional isn't present, we'll just error out and log that error. Otherwise, we get the existing user back, we set enabled as false, and then we update, save and flush that record. So you use the username to find a record, you update the record, you save and flush it back to the database, and then you return, yeah, that username was disabled. Everything worked as planned. So that's the delete API. And then you have getEnabledUsers, which is even simpler, which is just calling the, it's just returning that list of users that you get when you call find by enabled as true. So you have just return a new response entity, and inside of that, call user repository find by enabled as true. If there's nothing there, we'll just throw an error. Otherwise, return that list. So that's really all you have to do to create these APIs. The functionality shouldn't be here. Repositories shouldn't be injected directly into the controller. It will create services later, but essentially this is all you have to do. And so now these two APIs are mapped, and if you want, you can actually curl, same as you could before. So you curl and get these. It just returns a JSON list, a raw array of these objects. And then you could actually delete one of these with a post request. Let's see, first name, last name, take this username. Oh, it's a put. So he's been disabled. So yeah, that is how we created the two APIs. So now we have all three APIs. We have the create, the view, and the delete. So now we need to create our three front-end components. So we have to create a user button in Angular. So for that, we'll go to the front end code. Create user button. And this component has an HTML file, which is just a button, HTML, regular button. And it says when you click it, run the createUser function. So in the TS code, we have created this createUser. And all this is doing is we've injected the authentication core service. And here we've created a couple services that hook into the APIs. Exactly what we did with the health check way back when. So we have createUser, and this is a post request. This is basically the curl request we had. You know, that post calls the createUser API, doesn't pass anything, and then it just returns the response, which is created a user if it worked, and otherwise it says that it doesn't. But we've just created this createUser function, which is basically what the curl was, and we've hooked that in to when you click the button, you call this function, and then we use the async pipe because we're working with these RxJS observables. This is kind of an advanced thing, but it keeps the code succinct and it's pretty easy to get. But this is a pipe in Angular, and then it's async because this is actually returning an observable. I can go more into that if anybody has questions in the comments or anything. But basically, this createUser is an observable, and it returns a string. And so the async pipe will unpack that observable as a string. And so we just print the message that occurs when we click the button. So that's all you had to do for the createUser button. We have the view users table. View users. So I literally created a table, and the table shows up. Again, we're using enabled users, which is an observable, and this comes from the authentication core. So you have getEnabledUsers, which is the get request. It's the exact same as the get curl request we had, and it maps the user objects to these user DTOs, a data transfer object. So I just want to show the first name, the last name, and the username. I don't want to show the password. I don't want to show enabled. This is all I want to show. And so we get the total request, which actually returns everything. Bad practice, don't do that in real life. But for now, we're returning the user ID, the first name, the last name, the username, the password, enabled is true. We're returning everything from the backend. And so you can still see this if you look in the console. But we're going to clean that up. And we're going to return the entire list of users, but then we're going to map that to the interface of just a user DTO. And so we're going to return just a list of these users, and the mapping will be done automatically. It'll just match the first name, last name, username. So it's going to match that, and it's going to return a list of those user DTOs. So when that list comes in as enabled user, you can see the view users component. Again, we're doing the timer in case it updates, but we've set up this observable. It's a user DTO list, and then the enabled users, when this initializes, will be updated every 2 seconds with the switch map, and it will just be getEnabledUsers. So this observable is set to begin with. When it's unpacked, this table will come into being. That's what the ngIf is. So if this is a valid populated thing, set it to the table of enabled users, or set it to this list of enabled users. And then we use an ng that says let each user of the enabled users that we get back create a row for each one of them. So we have one header, first name, last name, username, and then for each user in that list, take the user.firstname, the user.lastname, the user.username, and populate. And so this is how, whether we have 5 or 10 or 15, it doesn't matter. Angular is going to create a row for us from that complete list. And then we're just using the table rows for the header, and then each row is is repeated here. So that is our second component. And then we have delete users form. And this is a form because delete user, you have to provide a username. So overall you have a form and you have a label and it's a username. So this is text. And then it's tied to this model username input. And then there's going to be a button for the form for submission. And when you click it, we're going to call delete user. Delete user looks a lot like createUser. We have an observable that we've set equal to the authentication core service delete user. And delete user is like createUser, except it takes a specific username. It builds the URL, the put request for the URL, and it adds that username to the end of it. And it calls the curl put request to delete the user, which is basically mark it as disabled. And then it returns that string value, whether it succeeded or failed. And then that string value, once it's unpacked here, is just printed. So you have a delete button, a view users button, and a create button. And so if you look at our routing, you can actually see how each one of these has been individually created. So if you go back here, you go to create user, you can see just the button. So we created a new user, and sure enough, we did create a new user. It just doesn't show because we had deleted one before. But that works. So when you create a new user, and then when you have delete user, these are routes that are mapped direct just to a single component. Here's delete user. You can pick this username. It says it's been disabled. Sure enough, it's gone. Cool. And then view users. So we are able to show you how, okay, each component, yes, can be its own thing. But this isn't super helpful. I mean, we have these three individual components. So we've created a dashboard component. And the dashboard component is nothing. There's nothing here because all it's really doing is acting as a dashboard where we have the app create user button here, and then we have a couple of breaks, and then we have our app view users component here, and then we have our app delete user button below. So we've just stacked our three individual components on one page, and then that is just this regular path. So you get rid of this, click enter, and here, these are our three components. We're showing the dashboard component mapped to this route, and this dashboard component is a composite of the three, and that's how we join together the create new user, which is here. You can click in that and it goes there. And then the app view users is here. More breaks, which are those gaps here. And then you have the app delete user button. And they all work together the way they would individually. And I think, honestly, that's really it. So that's the delete user form. And then we have the authentication dashboard component, which is just a centralized view for creating a new user. Seeing that, it updates, it's been added, and then being able to delete it. And again, seeing that failed to delete user because that's not actually the username. It's been disabled and it disappears. So yeah, we'll go through the code real quick, but I cleaned up the router outlet, so I just got rid of all the junk from previous demos. This is the app component. Again, I got rid of all that junk. I just deleted stuff here. I created a new module, the PJL authentication module. So this is where I declare the dashboard, the create user button, the delete user button, and the view users components. So we just declare this, and we import the shared module, which has our forms module, our common module, and the HTTP client module. And we have our routing module, which is where I set up, okay, this route takes you to this component, and this route takes you to this component. That's where you do the paths. So yeah, I just wired all that. I've done a few videos on modules now. So here's the authentication dashboard component, just the HTML, the CSS is blank, the test is just boilerplate. We're not at testing yet. Dashboard component's empty, I showed you that. Create user button, I showed you all that. No CSS, this test is just boilerplate. Create user button component, showed you that. Delete user button, the spec, the test, boilerplate. Delete user button component, showed you that. View users, showed you that. View users test. View users component, showed you that. DTO, I showed you that. The authentication module, I showed you that. The routing module, I showed you that. Application core services, all I did was update a name, no changes there. Authentication core services, I showed you the 3 services I created, which mapped to those curl requests that we were able to run through the terminal to hit our APIs. Just updating paths, nothing there. These are updating paths. I had to add the forms module for using that ng form, some of the ng form stuff. Environment.local, so I did update the local properties file just to say like, okay, these are our backend controller paths, and then we have a user controller which maps, the name matches what we have here, user controller, and then the create, delete, and get enabled in alphabetical order with their paths. And so I've used these to just kind of chunk up similarities to build up the paths. So I added those to my local.ts environment, and now we're in the user controller, which I've gone over. I did have to do cores again, so we haven't fully set up Spring Security in cores. So at the top of the controller, I just said ignore cross-origin stuff, and this ignores it completely. Need that temporarily until I put in a more robust solution. But I added the getEnabledUsers, the deleteUsers APIs, which I showed you. And then I updated the user repository, so I gave some examples of equivalent queries, but I created the 2 find bys. So yeah, that was a fun one. We're finally getting somewhere. Now I can move on and configure Spring Security, and we're getting a lot closer to a true, fully functional user authentication system. So I hope this is helpful. Let me know if it wasn't, if you want to see something different. Thanks. Bye.